Welcome on into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name's Steve. Today we're going to be looking at some of the news coming out of camp, other news, any kinds of interesting things going on in the fantasy football world that caught my eye as I have been doing each week. So hopefully these have been helpful to stay up to date and to clarify some things and of course give my takes on news or noise for a lot of these things. So let's start out with a fun little look at Garrett Wilson. So, recently, I released a video earlier this week on Las Vegas numbers, both for wide receivers and quarterbacks in one video, and then running backs and tight ends in a different video. So go check those out if you haven't yet, especially the quarterbacks, wide receivers video. I think a lot of great information. While we're here, let's just pause for a moment and let you know Tuesdays, Thursday evenings, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we've been doing practice mock drafts with the community. It's been very fun. It's been very helpful, and we're very close to a full room. So come on and join us. Let's fill up the slot so there are no more bots taking any of the picks. And in this upcoming Tuesday, the first Tuesday of August, this upcoming week, come on and join us if you want to be a part of the Fantasy Football Forge League. We're going to try to set that up, hopefully successfully this season. We did have enough people this last Tuesday in order to do that, and so if everybody comes, then we're going to have enough for at least an 8-team league, but we've got some spots open. Hopefully get that up to 10, 12 would be great. Now, 14-team league, 16-team league intimidates me. I have never been in a larger league quite yet, or a small league. So, going back to the setup here for the wide receivers, quarterbacks video, Garrett Wilson was one of the players that the Las Vegas odds makers, or the sports books odds makers, suggested that maybe we're drafting a little bit too high. Maybe we're a little bit too confident on the situation there. A viewer had a comment saying basically that they disagreed with that in ESPN mock drafts, he's going later, and that they think that he's a steal when they take him in the, I think, third round there. And so I did, of course, what I'm going to always do when I'm presented with these things, which, by the way, I love these kinds of comments. They force me oftentimes to go look at things, look at numbers, and that's exactly what I did to Garrett Wilson. Something to remember about numbers when anybody presents you with numbers is that they are trying to make their argument, and depending on how truthful they are or are not, to some extent, almost always, they might be omitting some sort of information. They might be providing the information that best supplies their argument. I mean, they probably will be doing that to the best of their ability. And so you have to keep that in mind, that there are always other factors that maybe weren't taken into account. There are always other numbers that you could look at, and so we're going to look at the argument that I provided this person, as well as going into a little bit more detail with those numbers, and then we're also going to look at some counter argument as to why maybe that argument doesn't hold such great weight. So to begin this, we're going to look at the numbers. We're going to look at Justin Fields' career numbers. He has played 50 games in 4 years, so something to keep in mind. He's entering his 5th year. He's had some injuries and stuff along the way too that have limited the amount of games that he's played, and with that in mind, he is a guy who has been getting better each year by the numbers, not all of the numbers, but generally speaking has been getting a little bit better. When we look at the passing yards, 7,780 yards, 156 yards per game is what that breaks down to. We're going to be looking at the per game number here for Garrett Wilson ultimately. Completion percentage, career 61.1%. Last year at a career high, so I was going to go with 63%. However, unfortunately, I just kind of aired out on that. I ended up going with 60%, which still isn't the worst thing in the world. I also continuously was rounding up in order to help make this number look better, if anything else that we come to. So this difference, and then when we also look at a different number for Garrett Wilson's reception, average career reception numbers per target, or reception percentage per target, completion percentage, we'll stick with that. Then it's also like 60 to 61.5%. So ultimately, this really isn't impacting the number, the fact that I forgot to go with this 63% that I was going to give him a little bump over his career completion percentage. Passing touchdowns, 45 passing touchdowns on his career. That comes to 0.9 touchdowns per game. And passing attempts, 1,119 over his career, which breaks down to 22 attempts per game. One of the things that didn't clear out would be those injury games. He has suffered several injuries throughout his career, so there are a few games that would be bringing this number down a little ways. Just something to keep in mind that, I obviously didn't point out when I'm making my argument in the comments against Wilson in that case. So let's give Wilson a 30% target share. That's a big number, and it's probably quite likely, so I feel comfortable doing that. His 2023 season, his highest target share of his career was 30.1%, so we also know that he can command that kind of target share as well. His career red zone target shares were 35, 26, 31%. Comes to 30.8%, so I think I just kept that at like 30%. Average depth of target of 10 is about, but lower than the last 2 years of his career, and it is significantly, or the last 2 years, I think that's probably should be the first 2 years of his career. Whatever the case, it's significantly higher than the 2024 number last year with Aaron Rodgers. I would expect that to rebound in this type of offense, the Justin Fields offense, etc. So that number we're going to keep that at 10, and that is actually bumped up compared to like the career number if we were to just use that. Yak, 1.9, 2.6, 2.5. I believe I rounded this up a little ways as well to 2.5 yards after the catch on average. When you look at Garrett Wilson's catch rate, 66%, 56%, 56%. We're just going to stick with the 60% completion rate from Justin Fields, which is I think a little bit higher than the catch rate was, but right in there. So, when we break down the numbers to figure out what is this average fantasy points per game that we should expect based on these numbers, first, how many receptions are we expecting per game? Well, you take your target share, multiply that by the amount of attempts, multiply that by the 60% completion catch rate, and that actually comes to below 4 receptions here. But once we would have bumped this up to 61.5%, 62, 63, then we would have been at 4, maybe even a little bit above 4 anyways. So it works out because I, once again, rounded that number up as well. So in half PPR, that's the number, that's the scoring format I'm going to use for this, 4 receptions per game. 2 receptions per game, 4 receptions per game comes to 2 fantasy points per game in half PPR. Then we look at how many yards are we expecting off of these 4 receptions. So we, of course, calculate the 4 receptions again, or I could have just put 4 here. And then we multiply that by the 10 yards, 8 average depth of target, plus the 2.5 yards yak, and that comes to about 50 yards per game. So I did round this up just a little bit to 5, flat out 5 fantasy points per game. And then we've got our touchdowns that we need to account for. At a 30% red zone target share and at 0.9 touchdowns per game, if he were to catch one of those targets, I'm not even reducing this by completion percentage. Let's just say he catches about a third of the opportunities that he gets. That comes to 0.27 touchdowns per game on average, which comes to 1.62 fantasy points per game. We add those numbers up together to plus 5, plus 1.6, and we get 8.6 fantasy points per game, which obviously is not an incredibly high number. That would have been between wide receiver 50 in 2024, which would have placed him between Alec Pierce and Deebo Samuel for an idea of what wide receiver 50 feels like in fantasy football. Now, I want to be very clear here. I'm not ranking Garrett Wilson thinking he's going to be the wide receiver 50. He's my 18th ranked wide receiver. But should these numbers cause some sort of yellow flag? I do think so, and that's why maybe I'm just a touch hair lower on Garrett Wilson than the ADP anyways. Now, there's more to this argument. Like I said, I'm going to provide a different take on it as well that you could look at. When you look at the 2023 season with the Chicago Bears, Justin Fields had, I think, his best receiving target that he's had in his entire career in DJ Moore. DJ Moore finished as the wide receiver 10 via average fantasy points per game and half PPR scoring that season. But Justin Fields also missed some games. That's why I say in 2023's full weeks with Justin Fields as his quarterback are the numbers that we're going to be looking at, which is 12 games, because in week 6, his 13th game that he started that season, his attempts and everything, he clearly got injured, if probably before halftime in that game or early third quarter, depending on how the game flow went based on the numbers compared to his average numbers in that game. So we remove that game, and we take the reception totals from all the full games. Going to hop back here to that wide receiver 10 average fantasy points per game finish. We could just call it a day and say, look at that. Justin Fields has had a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. We know that he can do that. We know that he could make Garrett Wilson that then, right? Well, once again, we're going to actually sweeten the pot a little here for DJ Moore's numbers, because we want to see what happened while Justin Fields was the quarterback, and while Justin Fields was the quarterback is better than the numbers when Justin Fields was not the quarterback. In fact, I believe he had 0 touchdowns in games that Justin Fields was not the quarterback that season. So we take the reception totals from each of those games. They combine to be 71 total receptions. You divide that by the 12 games that he played as complete full games with Justin Fields, and you get an average of 6 receptions per game. When we look at the yardage totals, that comes to 1,202 total yards divided by 12 games, gets you 92 yards per game. And he had 8 touchdowns that season on 12 games. Very impressive number. That comes to 0.7 touchdowns per game on average, or 4.2 fantasy points per game off of touchdowns. So we take the 9.2 yards per game, we take the 3 points per receptions for half PPR scoring, and these 4.2 fantasy points per game for the expected touchdown numbers on average per game, and you get an average of 16.4 fantasy points per game, which would have been the wide receiver 2 last season, and that season would have been the wide receiver 6 in 2023. So, once again, even better than that wide receiver 10 finish that he had that season. Now, there is one massive outlier game in this small sample set, a 230-yard game where he had 8 receptions, one of the higher, tied for 4th or 3rd, I believe, in the highest reception numbers, 11, 9, 8, and 8. So yeah, tied for 3rd most receptions per game, and an extreme large amount of yards. Also, 3 touchdowns in that game. So obviously an outlier game. If we were to remove those numbers, now I'm showing a little bit less work here, but just trust me, we remove those numbers, you get 2.7 fantasy points per game for touchdowns. You come to 2.9 points per reception. The reception number basically stayed the same anyways, just went down a touch. And you come down to 7.9 fantasy points per game for yardage, or 79 yards per game instead of the 92 yards per game. That'll get you 13.5 fantasy points per game, which would have been the wide receiver 15 last season, and in 2013, actually, the wide receiver 13, so right in that range. My final take on all of this information is that you're probably drafting Garrett Wilson at his ceiling, basically. And I also want to point out, we take out that one big touchdown game. Well, that's not completely fair, because we didn't take out any games for any other wide receivers, and we know that those top 10 wide receivers obviously would have had a couple of larger games. Most likely, like an Amon-Ra St. Brown might not necessarily have that outlier game throughout his year, but some of them will. And so, this is just an idea of what the weekly expectation would be, even if that final season number might be a little bit better due to 1 or 2 big games. But talking about drafting Garrett Wilson, I think we're probably drafting him at his ceiling. I don't love drafting players at their ceilings. It doesn't mean I'm not willing to draft them at their ceiling, depending on what the board likes, depending on what I've drafted up to that point in the draft. Something else to keep in mind as a bit of a counterpoint to these very promising numbers from DJ Moore as to what we could potentially hope for from Garrett Wilson is that DJ Moore has averaged 14.2 yards per target over his career, whereas Garrett Wilson has averaged 6.9 yards per target on average throughout his career. That's over double for DJ Moore in terms of that baseline yardage per reception. So obviously that adjusted for Garrett Wilson's career, if that number were to stay the same, maybe that increases this year. In fact, I would say it probably will increase over his career average this year to some extent. Then you don't quite reach the heights that DJ Moore reached, because now you're looking at, instead of 92 yards per game, we're back to like that 50 yards per game that we were looking at, an average of 4 points less than per game, roughly there, and that will significantly reduce these numbers to an extent. So always keep every number in mind, all the factors in mind as you can when you're doing analysis, and the more in-depth the better, but at some point you just have to cut it off. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to cut that off because we've got other news, we've got other interesting stuff to cover here, and we're going to start off with the 49ers, who worked out veterans this week, running back Jeff Wilson and D'Ernest Johnson. Is this news or is this noise? And I think that this is actually news, even if these guys don't take any carries throughout the season. And I think that is bad news for Isaac Guerendo, both of these guys, but more so, in my opinion, actually, for the rookie running back in Jauan Jennings. Now, I'm on record saying that I believe that Jauan Jennings was, previous to this information, will be the backup to CMC, the true backup. In both cases, whether CMC is the starter or Jauan Jennings is we'll just call him the 1A in this scenario, I do think that Isaac Guerendo gets some work as the change of pace back, his workload being greater in the event that CMC is out and Jauan Jennings is the 1A, whereas he is the 2 to CMC instead of being the 1B to Jauan Jennings. The fact that they are looking, however, out in the veteran wide receiver market does concern me. I don't think there were any significant injuries in the running back room to cause this to be the case. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but the fact that they're looking at this market does concern me in a couple of ways. It tells me that I'm probably correct, or, quite potentially correct on Isaac Guerendo and what the team thinks of him. They're not interested in giving him a full workload, and they don't trust that. And B, they're not happy with where Jauan Jennings is at this point in the offseason. They don't feel that they could currently, now this could change by the time we get into the season, trust him to be the 1A in the event that McCaffrey were to go down, and that's why they're looking at bringing in a veteran presence into this room in the event that things break down with Christian McCaffrey. Those are my takes on it. Feel free to disagree, of course, and as always, sound off in the comments. Let's bring us on to the next bit of interesting news coming out, or is it not? Maybe it's just noise. Is it news? Is it noise? The Colts are experimenting in training camp with letting rookie tight end Tyler Warren take handoffs. I almost said handcuffs. Take handoffs like a fullback. Now, I think that this is noise in terms of fantasy football and your actionability on that for the most part. This is a part of Tyler Warren's scouting report. He is a move tight end, and he's also a previous quarterback. There will be a few trick plays that they will run throughout this year, with Tyler Warren being the centerpiece of the trick. The impact on fantasy will probably be minimal in most situations. The true fantasy bump might happen once on the season when he pulls back and he throws a passing touchdown, most likely right along the goal line, so not a lot of bonus points for receiving yards, but that 4 points for that receiving touchdown. Maybe that happens twice throughout the year. It's nothing that you can truly bank on a week in and week out basis, and who knows, does that happen during a bad performance otherwise that week, or does it build upon a really good performance? So it's not nothing, it's just not anything that I think that you can truly bank on. If I would put an over-under on pass attempts for Tyler Warren, I would put it at 4, which is, once again, not nothing, but nothing you can bank on any bit of consistency. Rushing attempts along the goal line are also something to think about for Tyler Warren, and what I would say about that kind of look is that gets really interesting or different. The likelihood of that happening, I think, is reduced when you have Anthony Richardson in as your quarterback, your starter. But, of course, you could also do something really tricky, but you'd probably only do that maybe once in the year, and then you keep it again for in the playoffs with Anthony Richardson and Tyler Warren doing something funky. And then you've got Daniel Jones, when or if he is the starting quarterback, then that actually would increase the likelihood that he might get some of those goal line rushing attempts. it would make enough sense. It's a part of his game. So there is like a little bit of a bump, I would say, to his overall value, but it's a very, speculative bump that's hard to put too much stock in. Third item up here, Zay Flowers did not participate at the end of practice on Wednesday of this week with a lingering knee/leg injury. All of the sounds of it so far are that this is nothing to be too concerned about, so we're not going to be too concerned about. We are aware of it now, so we keep an eye on it, keep it in the back of our minds, but once again, not overly concerning. Next up, Noah Fant is signing with the Bengals. Is this news or is this noise? Well, the Bengals have been on a long-time search here for several years now for a stud tight end that they would love to add into this room, that they do not have to pay stud money to. They're not looking to go out and pay someone. They're looking to find someone somehow, some way, through the draft, most likely. But this has provided another opportunity for them to take a shot at the previous first-round draft pick, still not young, but still at a point where maybe you can find something from that. So my only thing here would be that this might be a little bit of news if you're someone who likes Mike Gesicki, because I would expect Noah Fant to potentially eat into his workload in some form or another, and of course potentially even become the starter over him. But we won't bet on that. But this should be enough to put you off of Gesicki. I would say take an opportunity elsewhere that's a little less clouded suddenly. Next up, we have a really interesting one out of Cleveland Browns training camp. Diontae Johnson receiving a lot of those viral highlight clips coming out of there, more so than a lot of other players even. So is this news or is this noise? Well, Diontae Johnson is a player that I am much higher on than the public is, but I just haven't really been able to talk about it at all because he's still low enough in my rankings, and it's still a risky enough prospect and not necessarily a receiving attack that I'm trying to get a part of, that it's just not something that's really ever come up. But if you look at my rankings, I have been significantly higher on him than the public. But he is the reason that my projections, and thus especially early on in the offseason, my rankings were significantly lesser so for the other receiving options compared to the ADP, compared to the public, for players like David Njoku, Jerry Jeudy, and Tillman. That combined with me expecting them, Quinshon Judkins to reestablish the run there in Cleveland, but at least early season. This definitely might be more pass-heavy if Joe Flacco's the quarterback. They don't have that early second-round running back that they drafted. They're back to a fourth-rounder and last year's running back that they did not trust very much. So passing attack could be greater than when I originally did my projections. But Diontae Johnson, it's obviously very, very ugly. Given last year, he goes to 3 different teams throughout the season and doesn't do anything. But there is a real chance that Diontae Johnson, we know that he has talent, that he has an impact on the fantasy values of these other players in Cleveland's receiving attack. And there's even a chance that he's usable as I would probably say a waiver wire wide receiver throughout the season, emergency type of play, good matchup and everything. You pick him up to use, during the bye weeks. I'm going to call this news because I don't think that anyone is factoring in Diontae Johnson, who is probably the wide receiver 2 in Cleveland, into the equation when they're thinking about these other players and what their potential ceilings are and even their floors. Then a few quicker items here to wrap this up. It looks like Malik Nabers is good. He is supposed to be rejoining practice as of today, Thursday, July 31st. He is supposed to rejoin. Of course, things could always happen between now and when this video gets released tomorrow or maybe Saturday. I might move these to Saturdays. Xavier Worthy suffered a concussion in practice this week. So concussions, they're fluid situations. More often than not, players are quickly able to recover and they're fine. But we know they can go south, and they can go heavily south even, and end careers. So it's just always something that we want to keep in mind. I will, at this point, you're probably not going to change your opinion too much on Xavier Worthy due to a concussion at this point in the off season. That would most likely be silly, but keep an eye on it. Good news out of camp on Jack Bech. After last week, we had maybe some concerning news that did not personally concern me too much, and that is that, and this is so true of who Jack Bech is as a player. Once the pads went on during practices, according to reports, the dog came out in Jack Bech. I have no doubt about that. So look at that, Jack Bech rebounding with the good news. Same with Jaden Blue. He was on this, I think, with some bad news last week. All of a sudden, the reports are that he's playing really hard. And I think I mentioned that is, sometimes these comments about a negative comment about a player is not said to bash the player. Most likely it's said to try to motivate them. So maybe that's what happened with Jaden Blue. He got the message and he turned things around already, and that would be very promising for him. And last up here, what we have is a rare, as of late at least, good take by Aaron Rodgers himself, who said that any disrespect of the head coach there, Mike Tomlin, is complete and utter BS. And you know what? Do you smell what I'm cooking here? Because the Steve says... I agree with Aaron Rodgers. I mean, Mike Tomlin's one of the best coaches in the NFL. I don't think there's a good argument against that, and sometimes the hate gets a little bit too strong because people want more. Understandable at a certain point, yes, of course, but he's one hell of a good coach. Post-editing Steve here with some storylines that have happened since filming the video originally, so we'll just cruise through these a little bit quicker, but a few things here. Jauan Jennings re-injured the same calf that was bothering him during OTAs, and there is no timetable for his return, according to Kyle Shanahan. I'm not drafting him as confidently as earlier as I was previously. I moved him back in my rankings. I am concerned about this, but it also might be just a contract thing. It might really be nothing. So I'm not ultimately fully concerned about it. I'm still willing to take him basically at his ADP, but I'm no longer forcing, just super excited to get him or taking him even a little bit earlier than that just to get him because I thought he was worth it. The next item here is that Travis Hunter has very evenly split his time between offense and defense so far at camp. And this has been my major concern with Travis Hunter. It has nothing to do with his skill set, but if they're truly going to be using him a lot on both sides of the ball, or to a limited extent on both sides of the ball, that really makes me concerned for one reason or another for him in terms of fantasy. And one of the big things is he's not the biggest guy. He doesn't have the most durable frame. Honestly, I mean, this has to make it more than 2 times likely that he's going to get injured than the average player, because he's not only going to be on the field potentially up to 2 times more than other players, maybe, but that also puts an additional strain on the body being out there that often, so I just don't see how he makes it through a season healthy if he's being used heavily on both sides of the ball. Then we've got our next item here. Baker Mayfield got a contusion on his throwing hand. That contusion is a bruise, if you're not familiar with that. There are such things as deep bruises, bad bruises, but ultimately he should be just fine by the time that the season starts. And then we've got Jahmyr Gibbs taking first-team reps with the first-team offense. Previously, under the previous offensive coordinator, that was Montgomery's role. He was the first one taking those reps, and I have talked about this quite a bit this offseason. Look, it's a new offensive coordinator in town. Things are probably going to change when you have a running back like Jahmyr Gibbs. It's tough to not just use him more because he ultimately is more talented than David Montgomery and a better running back. I didn't put it up on here. The other bit of news is Terry McLaurin requested a trade, and I have talked about this some or significantly last night, Thursday evening, when we were doing our mock drafts. It's a lot of people are curious about it. I'm pretty sure it's posturing for him to get a new contract with the team. Not necessarily anything more than that. To just apparently the trade, the contract talks stalled. ultimately, it's just so hard for me to believe that the Washington Commanders can even trade him away. Like, they need him, if for no other reason, for Jaden Daniels' success long term. So I think they need to look at some of the money spent towards Terry McLaurin as an investment in their young quarterback's future. There we go. That's it for this video. Hope you learned something. Hope you got some good information from it. And thank you very much. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Have a good one. And don't forget to join us for some drafts, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Tuesdays, Thursday evenings. We might have to add another day in there as we get closer to the drafts very soon. So maybe I'll do that next week. Maybe a Saturday evening ones. Bye-bye.